Every parent worries about their children's future. Will they keep their faith? Will they withstand the pressure of social media, public schools, college? But what about a culture that increasingly rejects Christianity? What if we've been asking the wrong question? Maybe the greatest danger isn't that our children don't know enough Bible verses. Maybe it's that they don't understand the worldview behind what they're hearing every single day. Now, apologetics is important, but today apologetics isn't enough by itself. Before our children can defend their faith, they have to understand the difference between a biblical worldview and every competing worldview that's discipling them today through entertainment, education, politics, and social media. Hi everyone, I'm Lenny Esposito, and in this episode of Come Let Us Reason Together, I'm joined by author Natasha Crain to talk about why culture has changed so dramatically, why the family has become the next battleground, what human flourishing really means, and how parents and grandparents can prepare the next generation to stand firm. I think this is one of the most important conversations that parents can have with their children, and that's all coming up next on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Well, welcome again, everyone, to another Come Let Us Reason Together. And this week, I am very excited to welcome our guest, Natasha Crain. Natasha is a good friend of the ministry. She's an author. She's an apologist. She's been working on issues of Christian worldview, ideas, and how culture is shaping society. And in fact, her latest book that just came out, I believe last year, is entitled When Culture Hates You, which is a fascinating study and an approach to how Christians can not merely understand what's happening in our cultural movement today, but how they can react winsomely, as well as answer some of the bigger objections or the caricatures of Christianity that are proliferating throughout our culture today. Natasha has written several different books, and starting with your first one was, what was it, Natasha? Was the
Keeping Your Kids on God's Side.
Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, that's right. So she's written Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, all kinds of things, and we're gonna talk about a bunch of issues today. So first of all, welcome. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Nice to get together. It's the first time we've gotten to actually talk through the medium, so that's exciting as well. Now, as you'd mentioned, your first book, Keeping Kids on God's Side, was written several years ago. You're a mother of 3 children, and obviously these things raise concern. At the same time, you have a sensitivity and an interest in ideas, worldview, culture shaping. How did all of this come about? What brought you into the realm of worldview and apologetics?
Yeah, so Keeping Your Kids on God's Side came out in 2016. So it's been a while now. I guess that's, wow, time goes by so
10
fast,
years.
right? It's been a decade. Yeah, it's been a decade. But the reason that even came about was because in 2011, I decided to start a blog. And that was kind of the heyday of blogging. Today, it's kind of, it's a smaller niche thing when people are talking about blogging. But back then, everybody was starting a blog in 2011. And I thought, yeah, that sounds kind of interesting, kind of fun. I think I could do that. I had 3 kids under 3 years old at the time. And it was just kind of one of those, I'll do this on the side when, the kids are sleeping and just see what happens. But I wasn't planning to be a writer, speaker, or doing any of the things that I'm doing now, just to be clear. So I started this blog, and it was called Christian Mom Thoughts. Very generic kind of name. And I just thought that I was going to be writing about the things we were doing with our very young kids to help them learn about Jesus at that age. And the more that I was writing, the more the blog took off and people started sharing my stuff online. And that started attracting people to my site who were actually skeptics of Christianity. So I was getting the Christians, as I was hoping to, but also a lot of other people who would come by to kind of make fun of what I was doing. They would leave comments on the blog telling me there's no evidence that God exists and that the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. Don't you know that science has put God out of a job? I mean, all the things. And I had been a Christian my whole life. I grew up in a Christian family and never had walked away from my faith, anything like that. But I realized when I started getting these objections that I had no idea how to answer them. I had never heard of apologetics. I didn't know know what that was. But long story short, I basically just went into this intense reading journey where I learned about apologetics, how you make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. And I just grew this passion for it. I couldn't believe, because I am a very type A analytical kind of person, I couldn't believe that these things had never just come to me naturally. And, you know, I didn't grow up hearing anyone talk about these kinds of questions at home, in the church, anywhere. And I had never really been challenged personally in my faith. So that was sort of the genesis of all of this for me. I turned my blog into a place where I was helping other Christian parents understand these things. So I would get challenged on the blog, and then I would turn around and write an article and say, hey, this is the kind of stuff people are saying, and here's what you need to know as a parent. So that's what eventually led to me writing Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. And then that just took off from there. And I've written 5 books now. My first 3 books were apologetics books for parents. And then my 2 most recent ones are cultural books, cultural apologetics.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So you actually came about it not through a structured systematic study, like through a program,
Right.
but you came at it through self-learning, which is interesting. So my story is a little bit the same, but much earlier. I wanted to create a website in 1996. So we've been online now 30 years. But in order to create a website, you need data, you need content. And I had to go back to a BBS back then. That's when BBSs were around. It was modem, you tie it up your phone. I mean, it was all of that stuff. So, I picked up a conversation between a Christian and an atheist, and what I did was I just basically answered the points that the atheist was bringing up, called it Answering an Atheist, posted it online, and that became the genesis of the Come Reason website. And then somebody else would write in the second question. Okay, well, we better research that one, right? And kind of in that similar vein, started to develop the process and develop all the content from there. So that's interesting. It's a very similar path. Although my kids were young at the time, it was more direct online interactions that kind of powered the whole system. So anyway, that's very interesting. Who were some of the authors then that influenced you the most? Who were some of the kind of the pivotal books that you're reading? Because as you say, and I tell this to people as well, one of the things about studying apologetics, theology, worldview, is it's ministerial for you. Everybody thinks that this is all about like head knowledge and defeating somebody else in an argument. Actually,
Right.
You walk away with a better appreciation for who God is. You walk away with a better appreciation for understanding how he works and for the integrated aspect of the Christian worldview, how it all works together, it's not ad hoc. And I think that's something that the broader church really doesn't understand, is how they can, even when they're wrestling with very difficult issues, once you find that resolution and you find out that, wow, really smart people have thought about this question and there's answers that I hadn't even considered. And once you get into that point, then you can come away with a much stronger conviction because you've wrestled with the difficulties as well. So who were you drawn to, and who really influenced you in terms of reading and things of that nature?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually, because looking back on how this transpired, it's not that I know it like some people can say, oh, I was driving every day to work and I was listening to, for example, Greg Kokel, on Stand to Reason. And I love Stand to Reason and I love Greg and working with them. And, and other people will say, oh, it was J. Warner Wallace who really brought me into apologetics. And so there's so many great apologists. But for me, because I was actually really investigating individual topics as they would pique my interest, it was much more topic driven. And so when I look back at the books that I was digging into when I first started, I mean, some of them are by authors I've never touched again. I can't even think of their names off the top of my head because they were so specific to the individual questions that I was looking at. So for example, the first question I really dug into that was bothering me, that I was getting kind of hit with the most, were questions about evolution and science. That was something I was wholly unprepared for. And so I read, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages on those questions, learning about young earth creationism and old earth creationism and theistic evolution versus, intelligent design and all the things. And so if you look back at my reading list at the time, it would be all kinds of niche books on those topics until I felt I could get my head around it. And actually, the last 8 chapters in Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, there are 40 chapters, 40 short chapters in the book. The last 8 are on this subject. And that was out of kind of my passion for helping Christian parents navigate those questions in a way that I couldn't find in existence when I was looking for those answers. Because every book that was written on those topics was, at least at the time, it was very much focused on, well, here's the case for young earth creationism, or here's the case for old earth creationism. I wanted something that would give me a high level understanding of the scriptural and scientific case for and against each of these views so that I could understand the landscape. And that just did not exist. And so that's what I set out to do with those chapters. So anyway, it was very much topic driven like that I would dive into. And then once I felt like I had my arms around all of those questions, then I would go on to something else. But I do remember especially appreciating, I mentioned Greg Koukl and J. Warner Wallace early on. Their books were very helpful to me.
Okay. Yeah. I smile because when I was starting off, of course, Jim Wallace hadn't even started his ministry yet.
Right.
Greg was just about, I think he was starting right. Maybe he was on the radio, KBRT, just a couple of years before me. But he was very young as well. I did go to a couple of his talks and things like that. But I was definitely more influenced by, say, the J.P. Morelands of the world. And of course, Josh McDowell, you read Evidence That Demands a Verdict. There wasn't the wealth of apologetic literature out there back then that there was now. You had a much smaller group from which to draw, so to speak. And the newer generations, it's really proliferated. So I think that's an exciting thing. Well, let's talk about your book a little bit. When Culture Hates You. And as you said, as your kids have grown and your concerns have broadened. First of all, before we jump too far into that, one of the things I think that it's really important for folks to understand, especially women, because as you know, in both theology and apologetics, it's male heavy. It appeals to this kind of analytical mind. And while there are a lot of great women in apologetics, there's not as many women either pursuing it, but also consuming it. It's not as female heavy in your audiences also. And one of the things I think is important to understand is kind of something that you say. So for example, you boned up on evolution really early because you got hit with that when you were really starting out in all of this. But that must have prepared you for, say, middle school era when kids are starting to study life sciences, and now they've got to have that addressed in school. And I tell people over and over again, when your kid comes home from school and the school has taught them X, and they're going to ask you questions because they know what we believe and they hear what the school teaches, and it's a disconnect, and they're going to come to mom. Mom's the first person they're going to ask a question about. So getting these answers right is kind of really important for mom so that she can shepherd her children. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's true, even though a lot of people like to resist saying it, but I think it's true that by nature, men tend to be more interested in things like apologetics. There are plenty of women who are naturally interested in that kind of thing also. So I'm not saying that that's not, that's entirely the case, but there is a skew there. I think that's fair to say. But I do think that the potential for getting more people interested in apologetics in the church actually is greater with women than with men because of the felt need. What you're pointing to there, because women are, the primary caretakers of the children usually. And so when they start to encounter the need, when their kids are bringing up questions they don't know how to answer, and they're starting to see the challenges that the world is putting in front of their kids, the mama bear kind of, peeks out and says, okay, I've got to get equipped on this. So even if I don't feel all that interested in it myself, I need to prepare my kids. I need to help my kids. And that's a very strong instinct that moms tend to have. And so once you explain to them, here's here's kind of the solution for the need that you have, that there's this whole field of apologetics where there's really amazing information that you can get your arms around. That's the evidence for the truth of Christianity, that you don't have to just have this blind faith or tell your kids to have a blind faith, but you can actually study evidence, objective evidence. You can see the mom's eyes kind of open up like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, right? I'm going to get my arms around it. And so I do think that women have more potential in the church to actually have that really strong interest generated because of the felt need of watching out for their kids, and grandmas too. I see the grandmas out in full force when the grandparents are trying to help their kids, or in a lot of cases, the adult children are not necessarily walking with the Lord in the way that their parents hope. And then the grandparents are hoping to help the grandkids, right? Then you see a lot of the same desire to really understand apologetics and figure out what they can do. So yes, by nature, I think that men might have a tendency to like apologetics kind of stuff more just on their own. But women, once you put the felt need in front of them and how you can have the solution to that, they're very much drawn to it in my experience.
Yeah, and as you point out, there's a lot of families now where the primary caregiving happens to fall upon the grandparents, either through daycare type scenarios where mom and dad both work and the grandparents are doing the after school child sitting, or just in broken homes and things of that nature. The grandparents are playing a much larger role in this whole thing. And also, I do want to point out, as long as we're doing this, I don't get this is a great conversation because it's something I don't get to talk about quite a bit. But one of the things that people think in terms of apologetics is they think of the debate, right? The confrontation. And that is one way, I guess, that apologetics is exercised. But that way is kind of distasteful, especially to a feminine psyche, The guys like to confront one another, or warrior kind of thing. But that's not the only way that this exercise, that this discipline plays out. And I've made a point before, and I think I've talked about it, where you can do it. There's three different ways actually that you can exercise apologetics. One is the confrontational, where you have to answer the internet atheists, and usually these are online back and forth. So you have to be real careful about that because it can devolve really quickly. I tell anybody, if you're striking the keys on your keyboard with too much strength, then it's time to stop and walk away. But one other way is to walk alongside someone, and just if someone's actually seriously asking questions, maybe it's a child, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, you can walk alongside one. But the third way is the dance. And if you've ever watched ballroom dancing, right, there's an idea where there's a structure, there's a form that you have to have. And there's resistance. Both people are pushing against one another, right? But they're not pushing in a way to tackle one another. There's a way that one can kind of guide the other. You have the lead, the man who guides the woman in order to perform these ballroom tasks. And apologetics can be performed in this way, in a dance where you're giving some resistance, you're pushing back, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to take that other person alongside you and have them see and discover things in ways that they've not seen and discovered them before. And I think that form of this engagement and interaction with someone who's going to be a little bit resistant to you is probably a lot more palatable. But I bring this up because, like I said, a lot of people assume that when you're talking about defending the faith, they always have these warrior scenarios in the back of their heads. And that's not the only way that this plays out. And I think one of the things that you're trying to do in these books, especially books like When Culture Hates You, is you're trying to realign those assumptions so that people can kind of see it in this way. So tell me what you think on that.
Yeah, I love the ballroom dancing analogy. I think that's very true. And people can execute their knowledge of apologetics in all kinds of ways, right? You can use the ballroom dancing, or you can be very bellicose in what you're doing. There are lots of different ways that you can use it. And so I agree with you completely that people tend to get the knowledge base mixed up with the approach, right? Those are two totally different things. You need to have the knowledge base, and you need to have the right approach that's rooted in a love for God and a love for others. And so you want to bring those two things together. So completely agree with you. And I think too that when people are thinking of apologetics, they sometimes do tend to think, well, I only need this if I'm going to be doing that one approach, if I'm going to be out there battling people. And when people think that, I think honestly that Christians forget how extraordinary the claims of Christianity are. So, if I like to give people this example, if suddenly somebody said to you, you know what, there was a whole flock of pigs flying overhead over the house next door to us, you would obviously not just believe them, right? You would be like, oh no, like for sure there were no pigs that were flying overhead. A herd of pigs, not a flock of pigs. Let me correct that. Of course that's not going to happen. You are not going to just believe people right away when they make an extraordinary claim. It is by our nature that we want to think critically about these things and say, well, why should I believe that? Right? And so as Christians, sometimes we forget that we believe some extraordinary things. We believe that we should turn our entire lives around and put our faith in someone who lived on earth 2,000 years ago, was raised from the dead, claimed to be God, was actually God. Those are some big claims, right? And if we forget how extraordinary that sounds to people who don't yet believe, then I think that we're missing the point of apologetics in a lot of cases. We should be more than happy to say, yeah, I know it sounds extraordinary. I give it to you. I haven't seen someone who was raised from the dead personally, but here's why I believe. And here's why I believe that this is actually true, that the Bible is true, that this actually is from God himself, that this points to the entire nature of reality because the creator and sustainer of the universe is the one who has told us this. We should be able to explain those things naturally as an outflowing of what we believe. And so I think usually it's the people who have been in church their whole lives who don't understand the need for apologetics because they have lost touch with what it's like to not believe those things in the first place. They don't know what it's like to think that sounds ridiculous. They don't know what it's like to be the atheist who on my website early on, I still remember this because it was so striking to me. It was in response to a post about Easter and teaching kids about Easter. And he said, I know that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead because I know from science that dead people stay dead. And at the time I was like, well, like that's ridiculous, right? I'm like, that of course that doesn't make sense. But I wouldn't have known how to just succinctly explain the flaw in what he was saying. And that's why we have to be, as Christians, ready to address those kinds of comments. Because from his perspective, it was a gotcha. It was like, I know from science that dead people stay dead. Well, of course, the problem in that is that he is presupposing that this is a natural event. And that's not what Christians are claiming, that this was a natural event. Of course, it was a supernatural event in nature. So anyway, it's just really interesting that people in the church don't feel the need for apologetics unless they're going to be out battling people, but then don't realize, wait, you should have these answers for anyone who asks you for the hope, for a reason for the hope that you have.
Yeah, so let's get specific here because again we'll talk about your book and what you do. Your book is broken down into, like I said, two halves. The first half is kind of laying out what a proper worldview would be, what it should look like. You talk about, first of all, why people would rebel against the Christian worldview, the Christian idea, why people would hate us, so to speak, and what we should be striving for, what the good actually is, things of that nature. And then do we even have a right as Christians to approach this discussion and why it's necessary for the betterment of the culture at large that we so do. And then second half of the book's kind of like I said, 5 or 6 specific caricatures that different subsets of the cultural milieu have placed upon us, and you hear all these all the time. But for the part one, why do you think now is a unique time to start addressing culture? You yourself shifted in your writing to cultural issues, and why do you think culture is becoming more concerning and more critical that Christians step up in the public square and start addressing these issues?
Well, okay, so there could be a really, really long answer to this. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. But I think a lot of things started to change around 2020 in terms of our realization of just how unbiblical the culture is. So the biblical worldview has been decreasing for many years within the culture, but according to the statistics, we know this. But if you actually just looked around, say 15 years ago, a lot of people would still be mistakenly thinking that, oh, but everyone's just kind of still basically Christian. I mean, we all still kind of value similar things because there was kind of this hangover of values from when people did have a more biblical worldview. So people valued marriage in a certain way, and they valued life in a certain way, and they valued family in a certain way that would have been more consistent with what the Bible teaches. But that was a long hangover of those values, and it really was in the last, say, 5 to 10 years that you started to see our culture throw those things off. And it became especially apparent around 2020 when you got the social justice movements coming out in full force. And that is what made me switch over. I don't want to say switch over because I still address parenting also, but I've been focused much more on cultural issues. Because in 2020, when I started seeing all the Christians who are getting swept into socialist ideas, Marxist ideas, and thinking that this was the Christian way to view justice, I didn't even know that much about Marxism at the time, but I realized that was in conflict with a biblical worldview, that this is not the Bible's idea of justice. And so then I poured myself into understanding those kinds of issues and studying Marxism in the same way that I did back in 2011, 2012, when I first found Apologetics. And so I started writing articles on my website that really were just trying to get Christians to better understand that there is such a difference between social justice that's based in critical theory and Marxism versus a biblical notion of justice. And so I think when that time frame came, that time period and everything that was going on, that was really kind of when all the things that were underlying the culture already, it's not that it was new, but all those things kind of came up to the surface, and then people started to look around and say, wait a second, there's a problem here. We have a lot of people who are really beholden to some unbiblical ideas in the church, leaders in the church who are going right along with this, right? And right along with supporting organizations like Black Lives Matter that said themselves that they wanted to destroy the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. You started just getting all these examples in the culture, and I think that's what really shifted for me and for a lot of other people at that time to think, we need to be addressing these things more in the culture. And now I think when you look at this 6 years later, 6 years after 2020, I think that it's very obvious in ways that it wasn't before. And so now more people are feeling the need to get equipped in understanding these things. So from that perspective, I think it's actually been a good thing for apologists because people are looking for answers in ways they weren't before because it's so out there. Now you see it everywhere and there are answers needed. So now people want the answers. When I first started speaking, a decade ago, it was funny because I would spend my whole time talking to convince people of the need for apologetics, especially parents at the time and moms at the time, and explaining why it's so important that, the culture is challenging and so your kids need this. I don't have to convince anyone anymore that the culture is challenging. That has been a massive shift in the last decade.
Yeah, we do apologetics conferences. I put on apologetics conferences, Dare to Defend conferences, and I've done that since 2003, and primarily prior to say 6 or 8 years ago. Well, 6 years ago prior, it was much of it was centered around new atheists. We do a Q&A session every time, and there's always the standard questions. How do you know the Bible is true? How do you know it's God's word? What do you do with the problem of evil, evolution? All of the Dawkins type objections would be prevalent. And when we do them now, and I tell people I have a young mother come up who says, look, I've homeschooled my kids their entire life. They've been in the church their entire life. Yet my 14-year-old daughter's best friend just came out as trans. And I know how contagious this system is, this ideology is. And she's her only friend. I don't know what to do. And those are the questions now that we're getting, which is a huge shift. It is a dramatic difference. I would say that 2020 was the culmination, was when all of that stuff that had been bubbling under the surface for a good decade, at least, in academia, in the college, because we also visit colleges and talk to students on campus and things like that. You would find that you would run into that commonly. If I go up and take a bunch of kids to UC Berkeley, you'd hear on campus this ideology in 2015, 2012, but it hadn't made the popular cultural jump yet.
Right.
That happened between 2016 to 2020. And then in specifically with COVID and everything else, everything blew apart. I think that it's interesting to see what's happening as a backlash to that currently, that we're starting to see a turn against materialism. The younger generation is starting to be tired of the idea that we're just molecules in motion, and they're looking for something that transcends that. So here's another opportunity that the church has to talk about a bigger story and a worth that supersedes just the physical. And again, you have to know that stuff. You have to be able to voice it. But it is an interesting evolution, and how culture presses upon us now is important because it dictates things like legal structure, where we're going next, what we value as a community, right? You make a matter of fact in your book, you make a definition of culture that's fairly accurate. It's basically culture is the vehicle, the shared assumptions, as well as the shared arts, edifices, and writings, attitudes. All of those are instructive as to how we should live, what we value, what we place our emphasis on, things we should do, we shouldn't do. That's what a culture is. That's what a culture does, is it carries a value system within it. And if that value system isn't Christian, then we're going to have a really big problem, because we're going to create a culture that is more wicked than one perhaps than it left. That was the big change that Christianity brought to the world. Matter of fact, my last podcast I did was what would happen. What if Christianity never happened? That was my last episode. What would we look like? And you find that the default is an honor-shame culture. You find that the default is things like infanticide and child abandonment, which were replete through all different societies. Slavery, which was replete through all of human societies. Women are usually subjugated and oppressed, to a much stricter degree. And if you even look at non-Christian societies today, you still see that. The masses tend to be illiterate. The masses tend to be not valued. And ultimately, human value, the individual worth, the idea of the imago Dei, falls by the wayside, and it's the might makes right. It's the powerful who rule. And that's what we see in culture. And I'm personally starting to see those cracks of Christian culture falling away and these old ideas coming back in our culture today, in the West, and especially in the United States and the UK. Europe is actually running farther ahead in that. What are you seeing in culture specifically that is where it's losing its Christian grounding and falling into something different?
Well, I think all of these issues comes back very specifically to one thing, and that is, what is your understanding of the nature of a human being? It's anthropology. All of these questions that you see that when we're talking about society and politics and all these controversial things that come up in terms of the nature of marriage and whether or not you can actually have more than two biological sexes, all of those, the transgender conversation, the abortion conversation, all of these questions come back to, what is a human being? Because ultimately, if you get that answer wrong, then you're going to end up going down all kinds of different paths, because you can't know if something is good or bad for people if you don't know what a person is to begin with. And that's the real challenge. So I talk a lot about this in When Culture Hates You, and just getting back to this definition of a human being, because if you're a created being, that there's a creator who has created the human race with a certain purpose, that there is something that we are made for, then that is going to answer a whole lot of questions about how we function in our society. If we are made by someone for something, that's a very different assumption underlying our view of reality than somebody who says we're not made by someone. And if we are made by someone, we're not made specifically for anything. We get to make ourselves. When you start thinking you get to make yourselves, well, then you are made to be able to do whatever you want, basically, right? There's no objective right or wrong. Then it starts to become about what makes me happy. That is the overriding goal that our culture has kind of decided on, right? Any culture that's not rooted in something objective can come up with its own idea of what human purpose is and then derive all of its policies from that. Our culture overwhelmingly has gotten to this point of saying, well, it's just what makes you happy. If having an abortion is what is going to make you happy because you're going to be able to pursue those life dreams that you weren't going to be able to if you had the baby, then that's the thing that you should do. That's what the culture is going to say. Because what is a human being? It's not a created being created for something. You get to define your meaning. You get to define your purpose. So you get to define what makes you happy. And if that means that you're going to have an abortion, then that's what you do. That's the culture's view. But it's very different when you look at it from the purpose of a human being being created by God for the purpose of knowing God and making him known. Then you realize, wait a second, no, every life is valuable. No matter where that life exists, no matter if the life has been born, it's on the outside, it's on the inside, it's still a human being. It's a different understanding of the sanctity of human life. And so you could take that and you could roll that same underlying value through all these other issues, and that's what you would find. It's all about what is a human being and what are we made for. And I think when you think of it that way, then you start to understand so many more issues across the board when it comes to policy.
Okay, so as this shifts, and again, you have kids being pressed in on culture. How do you best communicate then to an age group who, across the different media consumables, right? And it's so tough now because there's so many channels where they're getting fed their point of view. I mean, we're talking about this ideology, and it's the whole Disney thing. It's like, follow your heart. We hear it sounds like such a good message. Just follow your heart. Well, what if your heart's desperately wicked? How do you convey to your kids that follow your heart isn't necessarily the right message or the right path to take, and that there's something bigger than that? Because I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to constantly re-enchant our children, because our society, we're living in what we call a disenchanted society, right? Charles Taylor, The Secular Age, that kind of thing. So how do you, kids would naturally hold to this idea of enchantment. I think that they're predisposed to that. But how do you help them navigate the idea where everybody else is telling them, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever you want, you are the captain of your ship, and they conflate that with, don't let anybody ever tell you anything as to what to do. You can follow your heart. How do you parse that into a Christian message?
Well, I would say so. I have my kids now. I have two 17-year-olds and I have a 15-year-old. And I've actually been thinking about doing a podcast about this, what I've learned since I wrote Keeping Your Kids on God's Side 10 years ago. And, everything that I wrote in that book about apologetics is 100% still true. There's nothing I would change about that. Obviously, the importance of apologetics, that your kids should be learning these things. But I think my approach, now that I'm a parent of older kids and looking back on the things that I think are the most impactful that we've done, and people who followed me from a long time have probably seen me shift a bit in my focus from apologetics to worldview. And I really feel like that has to be the stage one training in all cases for us, for parents who are trying to disciple their kids. Because here's the thing. Apologetics is basically helping people who have two things in front of them, or you have more, but I'm just simplifying this for the example. Let's say you have two houses in front of you, two well-built houses, and you want to know which one is objectively better in some sense, whatever your measuring tool is, right? Well, you can have apologetics that look at that and you can teach your kids, how do you compare these two houses? But if the houses aren't well constructed to begin with, and they're just a mess, and you have boards that are crossing over between the two houses, they're not built well, they have foundations that don't all mix together, it's just a big mess. And apologetics doesn't land. It's hard for kids to even think about, how do I pick one or the other based on evidence and truth, because they don't even know what those two houses are. And the houses represent worldviews. So, in everything that we see from the research, even within the church, we have, 65% of people in America will say that they're Christians when they're asked, how do you identify yourself? But only 4% have a biblical worldview. So that just goes back to all these things like follow your heart and be your own boss. Christians don't even understand. They don't see that today, that wait a second, that's a plank that belongs in the other house. Right? We have our worldview completely mixed up. So apologetics is kind of a secondary issue to making sure your kids understand worldviews. And so I would think of it in terms of raising kids. Imagine you have two giant buckets in your house, of course, theoretical buckets, but you have these two buckets, and one is biblical worldview and one is everything else, right? And you could break those down further. You could say, okay, over here we have a little bucket for the Islamic worldview, and then over here you have a bucket for the Mormon worldview, but overwhelmingly the giant worldview bucket in culture is going to be just this kind of secularized worldview that I talk about in Faithfully Different. I characterize it in this way. I say feelings are the ultimate guide, happiness is the ultimate goal, judging is the ultimate sin, and God is the ultimate guess. No one can really know. Those are the four tenets of a secular worldview in today's culture. And so if you picture that that's a big bucket over here, and then on the other side of the room, you have your biblical worldview bucket, the primary task of a parent, I think, when it comes to worldview and apologetic subjects is to continually help your kids see ideas and put them into the right bucket. Because then you're in a position to talk about apologetics, because it's like, okay, well, as long as my kids understand the differences clearly between these, let's talk about how we know that it's actually the biblical worldview that is the accurate picture of reality given to us by God himself. That's a very different conversation than when kids have some kind of worldview they formed over time, in part from their friends at school, in part from some stuff that they hear at church, in part from you, in part from media. They don't even have a worldview that they can identify. And when you're trying to tell them, oh, this is true and that's true, it's very confusing. You have to first divide and classify. And by the way, I think that's especially helpful for parents to hear who have kids who are teenagers who are kind of pushing back against Christianity, because if they don't want to hear you talk about apologetics and they don't want to hear you talk about, well, here's how we know that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. If they're like, Mom, Dad, shut up, I don't want to hear it, right? Because teenagers can get to that point. Well, you can have easier conversations when you're talking about at a worldview level, not even talking about which one is true, but helping them clearly understand the differences. So if they say, I feel like I should be able to do whatever I want with my body. Okay, well then you say, I totally understand that from the perspective that there is no God who has created you and created you with a purpose, and that's totally consistent. If that's what you believe is the nature of reality, then what you just said is true. Of course, from a Christian perspective, if God created you and he created you for something, then you are not free to do whatever you want. Well, actually, you can do whatever you want, but it's actually going to be harmful to you, not helpful, just because it makes you happy. So it just depends on what is true about the world. See, you didn't even make a claim about what's true. You just helped them separate in their head. Okay, if then. If Christianity is true, then these things. If Christianity is not true, then these things over here. And I think that I've probably spent more time talking with my kids over time, just casually, about those kinds of worldview bucketing things than apologetics directly, which a lot of people might find funny to hear me say because I've written a book specifically about apologetics. But the worldview aspect is so incredibly important.
Yeah, one of the tools that I've found, and again, because there tends to be, and this is not simply, not necessarily with our children, although it can react that way sometimes, but even more broadly, there is a kind of a bias, an internal bias against Christianity. First of all, it's too well known, it's comfortable. You know, people are always looking for, well, oh, this ancient Eastern teaching that we've just discovered, this must be something cool, right? And that's always been attractive to people. And I say, well, I've got a 2,000-year-old teaching that comes from the Middle East too, you know. But aside from that, but one of the things that, because that you have that preconception, again, it's not that they understand Christianity, it's that they assume that they know what Christianity is,
right,
but they've poured some preconceptions in there. So one of the things that I've found to be very helpful is film or television, popular things that people consume, because there are some shared assumptions in there, and film as a common referent is a strong indicator of carrying culture. And I've used this many times to show how much of even Christianity today people assume. And for example, superhero films, I use superhero films all the time because you don't want your superhero to be vindictive or a megalomaniac. You know, you want him to be humble and using his power. Right, with great power comes great responsibility. And, you know, you don't want Peter Parker to use his spider powers just to win the wrestling match so he can buy a car or let the robber go. It was fascinating. I showed that clip to a bunch of junior hires. And if you remember the Tobey Maguire film, he gets denied the money that he won from the purse. And then the robber comes, steals it from the guy, and he lets the robber go by. And how you could have stopped that guy. He goes, that's not my problem. And all the kids cheered on that. Now, that's the guy who goes down and shoots his Uncle Ben, right? And the whole point of that scene is what he did was wrong. But this is the culture in which our children have been raised. Is like, you got to get them because they got you. And it was a stunning moment. But here you can start to talk about these things like, well, wait a minute. Why is it that Superman should help the old lady across the street or save the squirrel from the collapsing building? Why is that important? You know, where does he get that from? Because that's not the ancient Greeks. That's not Sparta. That's not Rome. That's not what any of those guys would do. That's not even Islam. That's Christianity, that you humble yourself and become a servant of all, that you put others' lives ahead of yourself. That's Christianity in a nutshell. And so, gee, aren't you assuming a Christian worldview and taking that point? But by putting it in a third person, you can really make those kinds of connections a lot better. And you can do it even with television shows. You know, most medical shows will always recycle ideas. And one of the concepts that's been recycled, I don't care which medical show, if it's the Good Doctor, ER, maybe I haven't seen it on The Pitt yet, but The Pitt's new. But it was in Grey's Anatomy. It was in House. The idea of an individual coming in with body integration identity disorder, BIID. Are you familiar with body integration identity disorder? This is when some person comes in and they feel like their leg shouldn't be a part of them and they're looking for an amputation, or they want to have one hand taken off, or whatever the case is. It's a significant malady in the sense that it shows up and people need to be treated for it. And doctors are like, no, I can't cut off a healthy limb. Why would I do that? You know, that's going against my Hippocratic oath. It's obviously something that the person's struggling with. It's obviously more psychological, mental than it is physical, because there's nothing wrong with the arm. And you say, well, if it would be wrong to do that, if you could find that episode, say it's wrong to do that, what about other body parts? should we be cutting off the reproductive body parts? Isn't it the same thing? How is it any different? So you can use something that isn't quite as politically loaded to frame the question, and then you could say, okay, now let's apply that same methodology over here, that same value system. In this instance, does it hold up? And it doesn't seem to hold up. So those are the kinds of things I've found really helpful, because, like I say, when you start talking about Christianity directly, especially with those who are a little bit antagonistic toward it, there's so much baggage that you have to unpack that it can be difficult. So let's say, well, let's find the common denominator. What's the principle? And then which worldview upholds that principle more appropriately? And again, you'll find that Christianity tends to do that. So that's kind of one of the ways that I've approached it. I think is helpful as well. What else do you see in the culture or threatening the family now and down the road? Because things are shifting. It's not 2020. The BLM movement definitely has crested and has waned. And there's been some significant, it's not gone. Diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, it's still very much alive in the college campuses. My friend Owen Anderson will attest to that. But many on the left haven't abandoned it, but it's not at the high point that it was. It's gotten some knocks, across where people have hushed their tones, so to speak. Nobody's coming up to you and demanding that you say Black Lives Matter anymore. So what do you think is happening now? What's the danger that you're seeing or that you're hearing at this point in time that Christians should take note of?
Well, I think it continues. The same kinds of things that we saw that came up with BLM actually continue, just in a different form that people don't recognize so much. And I think that comes back to the devaluation of the family. There are many people who would come right out and they would say that they want to abolish the family. And I think most people would hear that and say, okay, so those are going to be people who are on the far left. They're coming from this Marxist idea that the family is bad. I know that is a problem, but they don't recognize that same underlying mentality, that the nuclear family, this idea that there should be a mom and a dad and children all in the same environment where the parents are raising their kid, they don't realize that lots of people hate that idea. And you don't have to be the green-haired explicit Marxist to have those ideas. Those ideas have permeated the everyday culture, the popular culture, to the degree that people think, well, it's not really important to get married, for example. You can just have a partner for as long as you want, or polyamory now is a thing too, that it used to be just kind of a curiosity, but more and more people are saying, well, it shouldn't matter if you want to be married to one person or two people or never get married at all. All of those things devalue the family, because when you don't have a definition of marriage that is rooted in the biblical idea, the biblical truth of one man and one woman together for life, then that opens up to all kinds of things. I mean, there's no regulating principle, right? There's nothing that draws a line to say, well, okay, then it's only going to be this, because that boundary is always going to get pushed when you don't have the underlying objective basis for it. And so the devaluation of the family overall, I just would want people to understand that's not only coming from these far left circles. It's there, it's for sure there, but those ideas have permeated the rest of culture too, that it's about marriage not being important. It's about mom and dad being the primary caregivers for the kids not being important. All of those things come together to devalue the family, and over time, when you devalue the family, the fundamental structure of society, the entire society will crumble. Right.
That's actually the project that I'm working on right now. Is I'm working on a book project. And one of my chapters is focused specifically on the upcoming threat to family, and it's some of the more insidious, subtle underminings that are taking place. For example, the idea, as you say, how marriage itself moved from a covenantal relationship to a contractual one, how government became the primary one who would assume the marriage relationship, and therefore they could assume breaking the marriage relationships. We got no-fault divorce. out of that, which was a huge blow because it reduced marriage to a contractual aspect. And then you get things like even in vitro fertilization and surrogacy, where they start off and they sound good, and not all surrogacy or not all IVF is bad. I don't believe that. But it's become to the point of where, well, this is how, say, same-sex couples can have their children, and because it doesn't matter how the kid is created. It's just a matter of it falls into the arms of loving parents, but we've changed that. And first of all, that's not true. What we found research-wise is that, like, for example, sperm donor children, even with lesbian couples and others, sperm donor children have at least as high a drive to find out who their biological parents are as those children who were adopted and want to understand who they are and where they're from. So you have that aspect. You've got the idea that, of course, that those babies are thrown away. You just had a same-sex couple, men who had a child who the test on the fetus, the amniotic fluid test came back that there might be an abnormality, and they wanted the surrogate to abort the baby, and the surrogate, who was pro-life, didn't want to abort the baby, and so you see this kind of thing all the time, where children become now a commodity or an accessory to a life. They're not necessarily the focus of what the marriage relationship culminates in. And over again, I'm starting to see these kinds of dangers. In fact, yesterday's Los Angeles Times had an op-ed piece about how there's a bigotry against polyamory in the media. And these two ladies who are polyamorous were writing about how, we've got to do something. Obergefell smoothed the way, and, same-sex marriages don't seem to hold the bigotry in shows that they did before, but we don't see a lot of polyamory in our shows, and we need to see more of that. So all of that starts to come together. And I really think that the family itself is going to be the next large attack, and it's going to come, like I said, in some of these more subtle, insidious ways. Well, you don't want people to not have babies, right? Wouldn't it be nice? Yeah, well, there's a whole host of problems in surrogacy and IVF, from, over-fertilizing people to the entire almost human trafficking that goes on when you get third parties in Thailand and other folks like that. There's a ton of issues with this, and it's an unregulated industry. It's pretty much the Wild West. So I do agree with you. I think that family is probably the big target that is going to be shaken up, as we see in the next 10, 15 years. And if we're not ready for it, and let's face it, the church doesn't teach on this. The church does not talk about, when was the last sermon you heard where your pastor actually mentioned anything about artificial birth techniques? It just doesn't hit the radar. And most parents, heck, there's a reason why they advertise in Christian college newspapers asking for young women to become surrogates, because it sounds good. It sounds life-affirming. And they don't realize that there might be other issues involved. And so I think that that's going to be a really important point that we neglect to our detriment in this society today.
I should mention there's one other aspect of that too that very few Christians are talking about, and I talk about it in the last chapter of my book, "And When Culture Hates You," and that is the attempt or the activism around the sexual, quote unquote, liberation of children. And so this goes far beyond anything that most Christians are even aware of, but it is this it's this movement basically to say that that children have sexual rights, that we are sexual beings by nature, and so it's just the social construct that we've come to believe that children should not be engaging sexually. And if it wasn't for this kind of historical view that we've had, put onto us by Christianity and other kinds of religions like that, then we would all be free to engage sexually, no matter what the age is. this is a really terrifying thing, but it is the absolute next outworking of the same sexual revolution that produced everything else that we're seeing today. So it is not accepted by the mainstream yet. Mainstream America still today very culturally would say, no, of course we don't want children involved sexually. They would absolutely say that. But it is the same exact working hypothesis that has brought us everything else that we saw, that we are sexual beings and you should be free to do what you want. And that will extend itself even to kids when they're at a young age. And so if anyone's interested in that, like I said, it's the final chapter in my book, When Culture Hates You.
Yeah, there's a reason why Drag Queen Story Hour happens at libraries and in public schools and not in geriatric facilities. Okay, that's done on purpose. That's not an accident that they're targeting kids and not targeting adults. There's a reason why the gay pride parades, with all of their nudity and exposure and lasciviousness, are marching down Main Street and asking parents to bring their kids along and watch them. And that wouldn't have been tolerated in the 70s, but it's lauded today. And again, you see these kinds of movements, and it becomes wrapped under the guise of, well, it's just pride, and that's
and there are a lot of I'm just going to say there are a lot of well-meaning people who are useful idiots for this movement because they think it's just about gaining acceptance of those who identify as LGBT. They think that it's just about teaching their kids, hey, these are people who are, living in a different way than maybe you've seen us in our family or others. We want you to accept them. We want you to love them. So we're going to take you to the Drag Queen Story Hour. We're going to take you to the Pride Parade because we think that this is going to help you become a more tolerant, welcoming, inclusive person. But I say that they're useful idiots because in a lot of these cases, the goal actually is to get kids interested in engaging sexually at an earlier age. It's not because they want kids to better accept the LGBTQ community. It is because they want kids to engage themselves. And I know that if somebody were to hear that and they were not a Christian, they would say, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Like you're saying stuff just to be alarmist. Again, go read the chapter in my book. I point to a research paper that was co-written by one of the people on the board of Drag Queen Story Hour. They say the quiet part out loud. It's absolutely about teaching kids, from the paper, teaching kids how to live queerly themselves, rejecting all the norms that go along with all these kinds of issues with sexuality. And what are those norms? It's not just heterosexuality. It is an age basis. Yeah. So the quiet part is out loud in this paper. I encourage you to go and read it. I'm not making this stuff up.
Anyone who's dug into queer theory will find that the National Man-Boy Love Association is a real entity. They actually exist, so they're in there, and it is concerning. So the more I research it, the more we need to call attention to this, and I appreciate that. What other things do you think folks should know, Natasha, as we're getting ready to close here? What did we not talk about?
Well, that's hard to answer. We've talked about a lot of things. I think just in terms of When Culture Hates You, since we talked about that a little bit, I would just say that there are a lot of people in the church, leaders in the church, well-known pastors who discourage Christians from getting involved in advocating for righteousness in society, advocating for common good, getting involved with quote unquote politics. And I think it's a real shame because when you gave all those examples earlier of how Christians have changed society, that doesn't happen when Christians are not advocating for what is right, when they're not doing what is good out of love for God and love for their neighbor. So we have to really get this right as a church in a way that I don't think we are right now. We need to actually understand what we're called to do in terms of advocating for the common good. How do you define the common good, and how does that apply to the issues that we see today? Because there are a lot of people who would discourage you from that, kind of say, hey, Christians need to just kind of have our faith. We need people to like us. We need to just be apolitical. We don't want to appear partisan. There's so many things that people will say in order to discourage you from your involvement in the public square. And that's really what the goal of When Culture Hates You was to help Christians think through, what does this actually look like from a biblical perspective applied in today's culture, in our environment with our current issues. What does that look like? And so that's really the passion behind that book.
Okay, yeah, and you use the term common good, which has kind of some political overtones to it. The medievals would talk about human flourishing. What is it that makes humans aim for the higher existence, the best that they can be, so to speak? And I think that that's important. Again, what people have to realize is these aren't separate issues, or they're not disparate issues. Every belief has a consequence to its belief, right? In other words, if you hold to certain things, like same-sex couples are just as valid as heterosexual couples, there are consequences that follow from that. Same-sex couples, for example, cannot naturally have children. I mean, that's one of the biological realizations. So therefore, then you have artificial means of either bringing children in through in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, or bringing them in through recruitment. And the consequences that follow from that. Then you have the sexuality, right? The famous case of the two men in California who literally paid to have two surrogate children, and they were sexually abusing them as infants. Is that an outlier? Do most people do that? No, most people don't do that. But the problem is in society, every society, if you're not working toward the goal of human flourishing, then you'll have consequences. Slavery worked. Rome built great edifices on the backs of slaves, right? Slavery, it worked. It doesn't, though, make it right, because the problem with slavery is it subjugates a subset of humanity who bear God's image. And if so, you have to start with the belief. You have to start with the idea, because otherwise, we will not be the best that we can be. And I think that's what you're trying to point to in this book, is we want humanity to uphold the good, uphold the true, uphold the beautiful. And that's what human flourishing is when we actually align ourselves and become closer and closer to that which God sees for us. And that's kind of the way I understand it. So, well, thank you so much for all of this. This is great. We'll have to talk again. It's always fun to do these kinds of things. And I'll put the link to the book on our channel here. Make sure that that's available for folks who want to grab it, and all your other books as well. And we'll link to your website also, so if people want to read your stuff. Any last words?
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.
All right. Thanks, Natasha. We'll talk soon. Every culture is trying to answer the same questions. What's a human being? What is our purpose? What leads to genuine flourishing? If Christians don't answer these questions, someone else will. Our children are being discipled every day through media, schools, entertainment, and friends. That means parents, grandparents, pastors, and church leaders, well, we can't simply react after the fact. We have to intentionally shape the worldview our children carry into adulthood. So if you'd like to go deeper into these ideas, I highly recommend Natasha's books, especially When Culture Hates You. I'll include the links below. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's raising children or helping raise grandchildren. These conversations matter because ideas shape people, people shape culture, and ultimately, culture shapes generations. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, I hope you'll keep thinking carefully on Come Let Us Reason Together. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.